All right, everyone. Brazil's leader Jair Bolsonaro has come out and said, "Yeah, I'm going to attempt to deal with Cuba and Venezuela. I'm going to shutter them economically and hardline them. He's going to target them because he doesn't like their the way that they do business. Namely, Cuba is a communist state. Venezuela is a socialist state. What's Bolsonaro? He's sort of a populist. He's more capitalistic than what generally you'd have in Latin America, more along the lines of Chile's traditionalist government than what you would find in Venezuela, certainly. He falls squarely in with the more capitalistic side of world thinking, and presumably part of this is about refugee movements. There are all sorts of Venezuelans living in his country, and what I've thought is that he might use that as an excuse to intervene in a military manner. Because he's already said he's not going to force these people, and these are legitimate refugees in the situation of Venezuela, he's not going to force them to go back. That may be a prelude to him saying, well, we're not going to force you to go back, but we got to do something about this. Maduro refuses any reform. He's, basically just pounding the gavel and berating everyone else in Latin America on a constant basis. There's no other option. Maduro has to go. We're going to get involved. Our military is way bigger. It's got way more manpower. It's more sophisticated. Our economy actually functions. And we've got allies, which is another thing that Venezuela doesn't have. What you could see, worst case scenario, is a regional war. You would end up with Venezuela probably, allying directly with Cuba. There might be foreign involvement. You might see China get involved. They actually have a base in Nicaragua, I believe it is. Some of those Central American regimes are more socialistic. And then you have nations like Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and possibly Mexican or U.S. involvement that fall more on the economically slightly less left-leaning side of the spectrum. They're neoliberal instead of outright socialist. That's basically what it boils down to. If that were to happen, it would be a fairly major regional war, and it would really shake things up within the entire hemisphere, and hopefully that doesn't happen. The problem being, how do you pressure an economy that has no economy? Like in the case of Venezuela, there is no functioning economy anymore. What's the unemployment rate in Venezuela? Is it like 20, 30%? It's catastrophic. Rates that at the height of the Great Recession we didn't even get near are considered par for the course there, even during decent months. No, this quarter wasn't bad. Unemployment was only 30%. GDP only fell by another 50% or something. I think we did pretty well, says Maduro as he lights up another Cuban cigar and eats caviar out of someone's asshole. Maduro has no problems because he's got the military on his side. Cuba is an ally of Venezuela. I believe they do have a military pact. Not that Cuba's military. The Cuban Navy is going to sail into Rio and really cause problems, I'm sure. What is it down there? The Port Isabel or something down there on the southern coast. They're going to sail in there, and their two frigates will engage the Brazilian Navy. I'm sure that they have at this point lots of old Soviet gear. I'm sure it's very impressive, stuff from the 50s and stuff. Their aircraft carrier, what is it? It's some toy. It's a couple of consumer drones with 22 calibers crudely mounted to them that one tech geek there in Cuba with an internet connection managed to rig up after studying a bunch of threads on 4chan or something. That'd be very funny. Ultimately, hopefully that doesn't happen and it stays in the economic realm. But again, how is it going to be effective? Like, let's say all the other Latin American states just say, fuck it, we're not trading with Venezuela anymore. You already don't really trade with them. They don't have any money to trade with. Everything's already completely internalized within the state of Venezuela. Toilet paper is worth more than the paper that it could be turned into bills for. They stopped re-importing their own money because it was worthless. Look, if you load a plane, like a 747, entirely with the highest denomination notes currently in use in Maduro land, and you get it there, the amount of fuel that you've used to actually transport that cash into the country is worth more than the cash itself is worth. It doesn't make any sense. Economics there is in La La Land because it's a socialist nation. And Cuba's even worse. They're outright communistic. Now, there's a little bit of a slightly capitalistic tourist economy there now, but it hasn't been as much of a boom for them as I think some people thought. My hope was that Cuba would quickly open up to westernization, specifically because it'd be, the cash would come flowing in. And when people realize, hey, these tourists, they don't hate us, They don't really care that we're communists. They're too busy staring at our cars and thinking that they're great for some reason. And hey, I made 3 times as much this year. Wow, this capitalism thing isn't as bad as I thought. My hope was that it would begin rapidly westernizing. Instead, because of bad blood between the U.S. government, and Trump has contributed to this, and the Cuban government, the incident there with the U.S. consulate where those diplomats had like brain damage or something from a sonic weapon of some sort. All the other weird shit going on there. I think, by the way, a third party was probably responsible for that, specifically with an eye to derailing diplomatic relations. I do actually think that could have been Russians, it could have been the Chinese, it could have been the Venezuelans, actually, by the way. It very well could have been Maduro's people. I don't think the Cuban government, directly would do that. Or it could have been a cartel, in all honesty. Like, hey, if Cuba opens up to the West, we won't be able to ship these drugs the right way. It'll cost more, so fuck it. I think, though, that Venezuela, that's basically a lost cause. The opposition is also socialistic. The Venezuelan opposition was contacted by the U.S. The U.S. attempted to oust Maduro by holding direct meetings with the opposition there, and it sort of fell through. The opposition wants to get rid of Maduro. They don't want to get rid of the system that they have, and they're not friends of the United States. They're just less unfriendly. They're less openly hostile. Jair Bolsonaro, though, he does have, probably the mandate and certainly has the technology and the manpower to really curb stomp Venezuela back to the Stone Age if he wants. The economic problems could be severe on the hemisphere, though. It could definitely take a toll on world markets as instability grows and uncertainty grows. It could really hurt the fuel prices because Venezuela does still export a lot of oil, even though that's sliding backwards into slow irrelevance because it's fairly dirty crude, requires a lot of refining, and right now it's not economically feasible for most countries to deal with it, including the U.S. To large part. We'd rather get that nice sweet stuff that we have in Texas or Alaska, or maybe pump it through from Canada. It's funny when people talk about Canadian oil being like needing a lot of refining. It's like, okay, go down to Venezuela where this crude murk just sort of bubbles up and percolates through the ground, everywhere, and it's basically a giant lake of oil. That's how many miles wide is it? Like the biggest bubble of oil there under Lake Maracaibo or whatever it's called. How big is that actually? How much oil are we talking about? Like if we were to spread it over the world, the entire world, how deep would it be? Are we talking a few inches or a few feet? It probably matters. And very sticky and tar mass. It'd be quite disgusting, I'm sure. No, I think that having Brazil getting involved is better than U.S. involvement, though. Because let's say the U.S. gets involved. What happens? We get called the Great Satan. He rallies the forces. Most of the population solidifies behind Maduro. We probably lose at that point because we'll be unwilling to deal with the fact that most of the opposition will be civilians that'll simply be throwing rocks and sticks and shit at our soldiers. Now, you can survive that in a tank, but how do you tanks can't stand on the street corner and maintain order. But the Brazilians could go in with greater manpower. That would be more accepted, especially if it's joint with Colombia. You've got a lot of people who've already gravitated into those countries from Venezuela who could, join the cause and say, look, people, they're not here to invade, they're here to get rid of Maduro. Fucking let them do it. I think it could be successful if that were to happen. That's about all. Peace out.